American Library. It's great to see those of you here in person and joining us on Zoom. For those of you who are attending one of our events for the first time, the American Library here is a memorial to the 2nd Air Division of the 8th Air Force, United States Army Air Forces. 7,000 members of the 2nd Air Division died in World War II while flying from air bases right here in this part of England. At the end of the war, the officers of the division came together to establish the 2nd Air Division USAAF Memorial Trust with the intention of creating a living memorial. That living memorial, in the form of a library, opened in 1963 on this site. The American Library is free to visit and has a specialist World War II book collection, as well as books on all aspects of American life and culture. The library manages the 2nd Air Division Archive, which is an excellent resource for anyone interested in the lives of American forces in World War II England. And you can find more about our history and collections at americanlibrary.uk. The library also runs a program of events and activities, such as this evening, many of which are in partnership with the University of East Anglia. Through UEA, the library provides scholarships to American PhD students, such as myself. My name is Lauren Cortese. I'm an American scholar here at the library and a PhD candidate in creative writing at UEA. I'm excited to introduce our speaker this evening, Joel Young, who is here to help us commemorate American Black History Month, which is in February in the US, in October here in England, by giving us a talk, The Forgotten Chorus, the story of an African-American choir. Joel graduated from UEA in 2022 with a degree in American Studies. His thesis studied the experiences of Black American GIs stationed in the Norfolk area during World War II, which he'll focus on this evening. So I'll let Joel take it away. At the end, we will have a question and answer period, and those who are joining us online can type in their questions as well. Okay, that's fine. We'll just, you know how to do that?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Lauren. So, hello, welcome everybody. This is my first ever big talk, so just bear with me if I stumble at all. Today, I'll be talking about the relatively unknown stories of African Americans in Britain during World War II. And specifically, I'll be focusing on an African American choir, which I'll use as basically a case study to illustrate the African American experience and the impact that they had in Britain and that Britain had on them as well in some ways. Yeah. So. Okay. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the fact that the content that we are going to be looking at, just put up a little bit of warning because I'll be using quotes and images which will use some outdated / offensive language, words and terminology. So if I do read out any of the quotes, what I will do to stop it being promoted is I will replace it with the correct words and terminology. Okay, so a little bit about me. My name is Joel Young, and I'm a UEA graduate with a bachelor's in American history. And my interest is mainly in social and military history, with a main focus on primary source analysis. So for those who don't know what that is, basically I like looking at photos and quotes, and then I try and interpret them put them into a modern context and go from there. So these images here are from a trip that I took to the Cambridge American Cemetery and Memorial at Madingley, which is just outside Cambridge in the UK. And that's where my story began, really. So I was there about 2 years ago, and I was looking for a subject to do for my dissertation. And on a Sunday afternoon, I ran into the superintendent there, Matthew Brown, and he set me down the path of African Americans who were in East Anglia during World War II. Now, if you'd asked me beforehand, I wouldn't have known that they were even here. So I was fascinated, naturally, and then I went from there. So let's get into the presentation and a little about me. So for those who may not know, who are watching, World War II began in 1939 and it ended in 1945. The US, however, joined later on in 1941 on the 7th of December when they were launched into it as Japan attacked the Hawaiian base, Pearl Harbor naval base. African Americans signed up in their hundreds of thousands alongside white Americans to fight and protect their country. However, I think it's important to distinguish that they were not fighting for a white America, but for a Black America. Racial tensions at the time with segregation were pretty high. So their ancestors and themselves had built that country, and that was why they were fighting for it. Originally, at the beginning of the war, they were not allowed to join combat groups. So they were funneled into transport, engineering, medical corps, etc. Most of the ones that were integral in building infrastructure. They were trained really hard due to their race. And as it says here, that basically they were frequently assigned the more tedious and labor-intensive tasks during training without being allowed the opportunity to demonstrate their capability. Now, I would like you to imagine it's early 1942. You're on a convoy crossing the already treacherous Atlantic. However, it's a little bit more treacherous. That's a U-boats locomotives. The probability of being sunk in one of these convoys is 1 in every 10 ships. So these convoys usually went across about 50. So 5 ships in one attack, and these attacks were frequent as well. Now, with that information, obviously that's quite concerning. Imagine you hear singing, the comfort it brings, the ability to transport you from the uneasiness of the crossing. Now, this is exactly what happened to John Steinbeck, quite a famous American writer who wrote Of Mice and Men. And in his book, he references it, the book being titled Once There Was a War. I will read out the quote as well. Up on the deck in the blackness, the African-American troops are sprawled. They sit quietly. A great bass voice sings softly above the hymn when the saints go marching in. The voice says, "Sing it, brother." The black deck rolls with sound. One chorus ends and another starts when the saints go marching in. 4 times, and on the 5th, the voices fade away into a little hum and the deck falls silent again. I think this is a pretty interesting quote as it shows how basically you could be taken away from everything that is concerning you at that moment in time. You know, the impact, the comfort, the entertainment that these men had just with their voices. So, first arriving a month after Pearl Harbor, African-American troops were set straight to work. African-American troops were in regiments, as I said before, engineering, transport, which were vital for building infrastructure. Before US combat divisions arrive, they need bases, barracks, mess halls, training grounds, airfields, and hangars to come to. So in this picture, we can see, which I think perfectly illustrates that African Americans definitely were in Britain. This is First Sergeant Elko Bolton, who oversaw a truck company in Britain. And this picture was taken in June 1942, so in that first year that they came over. The story that we follow, however, is the one of the 923rd Aviation Engineer Regiment, a nearly all African-American regiment with the task of building airfields in East Anglia. So the men of the 923rd worked hard. It consisted of 4 battalions, the 827th, the 829th, the 847th, and the 859th. Each of around 750 men, excluding officers. These men were, quote, forced to work hard from dawn until after dark. The conditions were rough. We know that when they arrived in East Anglia in August 1942, they were coming into winter. So the conditions were cold, wet, and muddy, making it even more difficult. They had little recreation time, due to the amount of work. The RAF I, for example, in Suffolk, was expected to take 90 weeks to complete. However, it only took the African American troops 56, making it operational from December 1943, which was vital. And here we have some more photos, which is them actually working on RAFI. However, the conditions were not the only thing that was a difficulty for these men in Britain at the time. So here, I'll touch on that in a second. Here we can see quite an interesting photograph. In the center there is the white British cartoonist, Carl Giles. Now, this is his local pub, the Fountain Inn in Tibenham. And we can see him surrounded by both white British civilian faces, white British military faces, and African American troops as well. They're surrounding a piano. I can also see a drum set in the bottom there. So it just shows how key music was to these men and how it was spread all throughout the British countryside. So the first thing that they would do is when they would get off these bases is they would frequent pubs and dances. There was no segregation as such in Britain at the time. In fact, the amount of Black ethnicity in the country was quite little, only really in places like Liverpool and coastal cities. So for these African Americans to come to British country, rural areas, and be somewhat accepted, I'm not going to say that they were accepted with open arms, with racial tensions at the time as they were, was quite something new for them. So, however, when the US combat divisions came later on, in 1943 and 1944, US military segregation did follow them. So they were segregated on the bases. And then also the white Americans weren't too happy with them mixing with white local British people either. So from there, smaller towns, like it says here, like Irondice, often had white nights and black nights. There was also white pubs and black pubs. And basically, it was frowned upon for them to mix otherwise, and racial tensions grew even more with the arrival of white Americans, and fights, etc., broke out quite often, quite frequently. So here we can see, that was just another one of the difficulties, but here we can see the living conditions that we're going to be looking at. So when they first arrived, the first thing that they would build were Nissen huts like this. And they were cold, damp and drafty, often crowded. It was here that actually, though, a quartet began. So African Americans like to sing, as we already saw, as a comfort and to take them away from their current situation. And Private First Class James McDaniel assembled one of these quartets. And this quartet with McDaniel, the only trained voice in it, pulled the house down at camp shows and enthralled local inhabitants when it sung carols at villages on Christmas Day. So this just shows to us that these men weren't just singing for themselves, but also for the local people. And these people were also going through a difficult time with rationing, and the war having gone on for 3-4 years for them at this point. So this was actually a great comfort to them. Other quartets also formed in other battalions, and they gathered momentum singing African American hymns and spirituals. Now, the US military was also cottoning on to the fact that singing had positive effect on morale. So here are some excerpts from the European Theatre of Operation for the US Army Morale Services Guide. It acknowledges the importance of music and singing for the US soldier and suggests that the creation of choir is, as it says here, really important. There is one instrument that doesn't have to be requisitioned. Every man who joins the army brings it with him. It is the human voice. So here we have our first images of the choir itself. The quartets from the different battalions were pulled together under the enthusiasm of African-American Chaplin Perkins. Now, I've looked everywhere for his first name and I cannot find it for the life of me. So we will just call him Chaplin Perkins. He requested HQ to make a bigger choir, a choir of 200 men rather than just a couple. So as we can see in this photo, there is quite a few faces there in a very large Nissan hut. Now, they're all dressed in their dress uniforms, and I would argue that this is actually for propaganda reasons. So this was well lit, it's dressed up, and they all seem to be having a very good time. However, this wasn't actually the reality of their situation when they were practicing as a choir. And fantastically, the next quote on the next slide does a very good job of telling us what the conditions were actually like for them. And I'll read this out in full because I think it is probably the most important slide on this presentation. The chorus was to sing in a huge Nissan hut. The only heat was supplied by 2 British stoves about the size and shape of a short length of stovepipe. One almost literally had to sit on such a stove to know that there was heat coming out of it. Everyone was dressed in mud-stained work clothes. The men moved about in uncertain light, cast by a few undersized electric bulbs, trying to keep warm. Muffled and gloved and trench coated, we sat sipping coffee. But once the men began to sing, we forgot even the hot coffee. If there has ever been a more magnificent singing than there was that evening, none of us had heard it. Forgotten was the dampness, the crude benches, the gnawing of hunger. Forgotten even was the war. Each of us was caught up in a moment of superlative beauty amid the perils and discomforts of war. Problems of race and combat and physical comforts were forgotten. Now, I think that perfectly sums up the fact that these men and their singing really brought a comfort to everybody. This was a quote from Walter White, who was actually the head of the NAACP. And for those who don't know what that is, I will mention the name. It is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. Now, he visited them in 1943. So while they were working on these bases, and I am almost certain that it was in RAFI, which is one of the bases that I've touched on before. Now, they almost didn't get there, in fact, and he was in charge of questioning African-American troops about their conditions and the environment which they were working in. And then to have this to arrive and then these men sing with such beauty was probably quite astounding. Now, there's too many cards. Right. Now, according to an article from Yank magazine in 1943, quote, British farmers who heard the men sing at their work deluged the BBC with letters requesting spirituals. So it's obviously having an impact on the local community. A broadcast was needed pretty much immediately with the amount of requests they were getting. So again, quote, once all of these requests were going into the BBC, the London Daily Express immediately offered to sponsor a full-length concert inside the Royal Albert Hall with the accompaniment of the London Symphony. So it was quite a big deal for these men. They had probably only sung to small villages, small fetes, just a couple of men around a bed at night. And now they were going to be singing in probably one of the biggest theatres in the UK. On the 28th and the 29th of September, they performed their, I was about to say gig, concert is probably a more appropriate word for it. And it was an instant hit. There were countless articles written about it. And the British press raved about it as well. Famous African-American tenor Roland Hayes was flown over just for the purpose of singing with these men, just for those 2 nights, which really added to the scale of this. These men, you know, some of them felt like they couldn't sing at all, and now they were singing with one of the most famous African-American singers. The US ambassador, in fact, a white man called John Gilbert Winant. He was also present that night. And he said that hearing the chorus perform at the Royal Albert Hall was one of the 2 or 3 great emotional moments in a man's life. These men also went on to perform on tour. So they then toured to Manchester, Glasgow, and Edinburgh as well, where they also performed the same spirituals, hymns. From there, the men actually continued to work. They went straight back to their airfields. They continued to protect and build. And then after the invasion on D-Day, they went over to France, where there is a video, which I didn't include in this presentation, but I can always link it. There is a video of them singing in France to African-American men and white troops as well as the French, who had been through a pretty rough occupation at the time. Now, these are the faces of these men, and they are very hard to come by nowadays. I was talking to some of the staff earlier, and we were talking about how difficult it is to come across and put names to faces. And that's very much the case here. So the last thing that I'm going to do with my presentation before I round it off is I've actually got a clip of one of the songs from the Royal Albert Hall that night. So what I'll do is at least play an excerpt, if not the whole thing. And yeah, I'll go on to my thank yous after that. Okay, so here are some references from everything that I've included there. All the links, etc., are available. And then I'd just like to finish off with a thank you to the American Library for having me. It was a very good experience for me, that's for sure. Special thanks to Jacqueline and also the superintendent at Madingley, who set me down this path, Tony Phillips, who's encouraged me quite a lot, Lauren as well for sorting this all out, girlfriend, parents, everybody else who's here to support me. And then, yeah, I've got a dedicated email just because I'm going to be continuing my research. And if anybody has anything that they want to tell me, or they have any images or anything that they want to reach out to me about, then please go through that email. That'd be fantastic. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Questions? Got that up from folks online.
Yeah.
Is it comments about the audio?
Okay. Cancel that risk. Okay.
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 Great. So we'll start with the Zoom question first. Someone's asking how many African-American soldiers were based in the UK over the whole period of the war?
Well, over the entire period of the war, oh yeah. There we go. Okay. Fantastic. So over the entire period of the war, 150,000 African-American troops were based in the UK. And that wasn't just East Anglia, that was everywhere, basically, from Northern Ireland, Scotland, Lancashire, Yorkshire, down in Somerset as well. But the majority of African Americans who signed up during the war were actually sent to the Pacific Theatre rather than the European theatre. So that was where they were mostly based. But yeah, thank you very much for your question.
Any in-person questions? Can we go back to Zoom?
I have one.
Yeah.
Well, first, thank you. It's amazing presentation.
Thank you very much.
Excited that you're going to be doing more.
Yeah.
So I know we all want to hear about what you discover. So the contemporary reportage by Walter Waite, was that for a paper, or was that for the NAACP? Was that geared towards a broader sort of publication, or was it focused as often when stories were reported, they were limited to the Black press?
Yeah.
And there was a great, excellent reportage all through that era and afterwards by the Black press, which didn't necessarily get picked up for obvious reasons by mainstream.
Yeah, of course. Well, he originally was doing it as I said, as a report, so he would have reported it as an official file, but also at the same time, he wrote a book called A Rising Wind, which was published in 1945. And I do recommend it. It has all of the experiences that he came across in Britain. And that was a bit of a gold mine when I came across it for my dissertation. So and that's where I got that fantastic quote from. But yeah, so that was a broader publication, but whether it was very known or pushed, as you say, in the States, I doubt it was really. And I think he remained as the head of the group until the 50s, didn't he? So yeah, whether it sort of traveled in its own circles, maybe, but yeah, it was mainly a broader publication.
I think I wondered too about what was being reported about the just sort of conditions that they were in.
Yeah.
Because conditions were rough for most troops that were doing in this.
Yeah.
But were there conditions did you find in your research appreciably worse in terms of sort of basic provisions and where they were?
Yeah.
And then also the contrast between what the sort of PR was and what the performances, were there just
Yeah, I would say, I've seen things from both sides in terms of, I know that when some troops, African-American troops, have brought up, they've been sort of talked down by saying, well, white Americans are also in the same conditions, and that was true. But also at the same time, I think with the nature that they were worked as harder due to their race was definitely an aspect, which meant that their conditions were just that bit worse than everybody else's. And the amount of recreation time that they had because of that would have had a big impact in comparison to white troops who would have perhaps had more recreation time purely because of which ones were working more and for longer hours. And I've seen ones that say they were working double shifts even and things like that. So yeah, I think there is a lot to be, African-American press did do publications on that in magazines, newspapers, but whether it was actually raised, I'm sure it probably was with the sort of white corporate military, but whether anything actually came with that, I don't think so, probably. But yeah, thank you. Walter White was his name. Yeah, Walter White. No problem.
On the bases, the African-American bases.
Yeah.
Or bases, was the hierarchy white or black? Or what level did it transition from? So now, so the immediate hierarchy was black.
Yeah.
But
It was predominantly white. So there were a few officers who would be African Americans. However, the majority of the high brass were white, based at HQ. And yeah. Oh yeah, on the base themselves, yeah, it was still also white. But yeah, when it came to because they had local HQs as well, like for example at Stowe Market there was a HQ, etc., and that would have been white as well. But yeah, that would have been.
And you know whether many of those white people probably necessarily have had that much interaction with African Americans back at home. Do you know if it made any difference on their thinking?
I mean, I haven't found much research on that specifically. That would be really interesting, because obviously, like I said, there was quite a gap really between them being here and the other white combat groups coming over. So yeah, that would be quite a nice thing to find a gold mine on, really. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Entitled to the sort of education stuff.
The GI Bill.
The GI Bill stuff. When they went back to the States.
Yeah. Sorry.
Were they included in the GI Bill?
I'm not actually entirely sure. I do know that their conditions for when they went back, they obviously didn't receive the same hero's welcome that white troops did, and I know that they didn't have the same support in terms of reunions and groups coming back together. And I can actually see also this sort of answers on the Zoom questions as well. Did many choirs remain after the war? And the answer was no, because they all went back separately, their separate ways. And I know one story of one African American from this regiment, the 923rd. He only met one guy later, 30 years later, and it was passing in the street, and that was the only time he ever saw somebody from his regiment again. So I think it was, yeah, very disproportionate in terms of the support that they got when they were back home, etc. But yeah, thank you.
This one, and then we have a question coming in from Margaret, asking, will you continue with your research, and if so, in what area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I will be continuing with my research. I'm hoping to do a master's by research at UEA. I'll be applying later this year. So that will be what I'm doing, and it will definitely be focusing still on the African American troops based here. I think my dissertation of 8,000 words literally skimmed the surface. It was very general, very, in terms of what I can do narrowly. So hopefully with the questions that I can't answer tonight, I will be looking at those questions in the future with the future research. So yeah, thank you very much, Margaret.
And James was asking if you had come across any research about the Bell Hotel here in Norwich, which may have been a center for African American troops.
Well, I know that obviously the Bell was a center for troops in general, for US troops here. Whether any African-American troops frequented there, I don't know, because of the US military segregation, whether they would have had a separate place to white troops who would have gone there. So whether there is a place like the Bell somewhere in Norfolk and Suffolk that they would have gone to, I don't know. But hopefully, again, that will be something that I can find out. And yeah, I mean, I've been to the Bell many times and they have information everywhere about it. So
As a follow-on to that, there's also the Red Cross Club.
yes, yeah.
One of our sort of important bits of sort of original documentation was the Red Cross registers.
Yeah.
But I don't think any of those are any of those American.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
I don't think that they actually listed, right?
Yeah.
They just have, I mean, they do have the different groups and the different affiliations. that when I did the dance, I was doing the transcribing of some of it.
Yeah.
And have to trace it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to see the Red Cross book myself, and it is a fantastic document. However, like you say, it doesn't have that distinction there. And even if you did see a member of the 923rd in there, you still wouldn't know whether they're an officer, a white officer, or African American engineer.
Black African lights and white. If they
That
probably not.
I mean, it may have been the case though. Yeah, it might well have been. I don't know, but yeah. But thank you. Yeah, well, quite interestingly, I mean, I really should have actually put a slide in there, but there is a register of African Americans who did die and serving for the 923rd, and most likely it would have been in engineering accidents, you know, building the actual runways themselves. And actually one of the graves is at Madingley. So there is a man called George Brown buried there, and he served for the 923rd. I don't know how he died, sadly. I couldn't find that out, but I've been trying my hardest on him specifically, even to find a photo, and I can't find a photo of him. So, but I do know that I think I have 27 who died overall while they were building the bases over here. So, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, some of it might have been in a bombing raid, or some of it might have, because the airfields were targeted themselves as well. Yeah, it was proportionally quite small. But then again, they weren't the ones flying overseas and, you know, being right on the front lines. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Just again, comment on, I think there was, even amongst the air crew, for a long time, there was the distinction between those killed in combat,
yeah,
and those who were killed in training accidents.
Yeah.
And in our Roll of Honor, it was only, I think, in '67 that they allowed training accidents. I mean, it was a big argument within the association.
Yeah.
As to whether the training accident, so you lose a crew of 9 in a training accident, they lost a lot.
Yeah.
But they weren't included.
Yeah.
Right up then.
Yeah.
And even right up to 10, 15 years ago, there was lots of debates about who should get killed. If you're killed in a flying accident, you were allowed to go on the Roll of Honor. If you're killed in a road accident, then
yeah. And that is really interesting actually, because in my book, you know, if you're killed building a runway, I'm pretty sure you're, you know, in the military service. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things that is up against us in terms of the research as well. You know, tracing back and making these links is very difficult when there's different documentation for different ways of dying, for one example, let alone the rest of them. But yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
I'll take one more here in person and then
Yeah.
You said that the Black American servicemen who were serving here then went to France.
Yeah.
When did they see active service then in France, or were they still engineering? Or, you know?
Yeah, so the task primarily going over to France was to build runways, but also to rebuild damaged, repurposed Nazi airfields in France, and then going forwards in Holland and also into Germany. But I know that during the Battle of the Bulge, we were quite short on men. So they did go to the 923rd Regiment, and they did say, can we have any volunteers? And quite a lot did put themselves forward, and they did go to the active duty. But then as soon as they were not needed anymore, they were brought back to their engineering roles. So yeah, they did see some frontline action in the end. Some of them did, and some of them would have died out there. But yeah, the majority of the time they were still doing their building.
It wasn't for the fact that they didn't want to see an active service.
No, they were.
That was the only opportunity they had.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, if anything, they were desperate to see active service. I think that was the thing that they really wanted to sign up to do, and they were probably not happy with the fact they were funneled down into these other lesser, you know, sort of active divisions and regiments. As I said, they wanted to fight for African America, basically, and without being able to be on the front line to do that, they didn't feel like they could say that they were. But they definitely were, and if they hadn't come over here as early as they did and started building these runways, then, you know, that's another day later that the Americans were bombing Nazi Germany. So, you know, they had a real vital role over here, regardless. Thank you.
Asking if this was the only African-American choir that was around during World War II.
Thank you, Ali. So yeah, there was more than just one choir. This was the US Army's particular choir. It was actually deemed as the US African American Army Choir. However, there were many instances of, like I said, people, and there was a choir in Lancashire, there was a choir in Somerset as well. Basically, wherever these guys went, there was a choir of some sort. And I don't think that was uncommon, and it probably was also the case in white barracks as well. There would have been choirs, but it's just the fact that this one went so far and caught so many people's attention, which makes it really special. But yeah, thank you.
We'll do another Zoom question real quick. This is from Kathy, asking if we know who took these photos and would they have been Army photographers or others?
So yeah, so on some of those photos, you could see a border which had actual official information on it. So I would suppose that that was US Army taking those photos as a documentation of the progress of the airfields, for example, on the building ones. And then on the ones of the choir itself, again, like I said, I think they would most likely be propaganda ones. They seem staged, well lit, and in comparison to the quote that I read out, very different situations. If somebody had taken one on a camera that they owned themselves, it wouldn't have looked like that for sure. So I would say that, yeah, that was for the promotion of the choir that I was talking about specifically. So yeah, thank you very much.
We had another question in person.
Yeah.
Were there African American women serving here, perhaps as part of the nurses corps or attached to any of these?
Yes, actually, I know that some of the first African American troops to come over were women, and they were in a postal service, and they were based in Birmingham. And there is actually a really fascinating video of one of these ladies being interviewed, and she, quote, said that the British treated us royally in terms of the lack of segregation that, you know, she had seen back in the States, and as a woman as well, probably even worse. So yeah, they were over here, and they did have a very prevalent role in the US military's early time here in the UK. But yeah, thank you.
Great. And then another question online asking if there are many written histories by individual African American soldiers on their experiences in the UK compared to those back home.
Now, again, that would be another gold mine. I think that is something that I've searched for a long time, is a diary, for example, or something like that of their time over here. But so far, the only one that I can find is the famous Roy Otley's letters, who was an African American troop who came, well, journalist who came over here, and he talks about actually this choir itself. And one important thing that I think that he said about this choir was actually he disapproved of it, and he disapproved of the sort of the pushing of it by the white US military, because he thought, well, they're trying to make it seem like some sort of exotic, oh, this is different, you know, these, come and listen to these African Americans sing, you know, almost like a show, rather than what these men were actually singing about and for. So I mean, yeah, there are definitely materials out there, and there's probably lots in private collections, which would be great if accessed, but at the moment I haven't stumbled across any that are particularly useful in that sense. at the moment. But yeah, thank you.
Catherine asks, what's next for you in your research on this topic?
Yeah, so like I said before, I think I've got to see sort of where the wind takes me in terms of what next really grabs my attention. This choir was one of them, really grabbed my attention, and that's why I decided to use it, focus on this for this presentation. Whether I continue to talk about the engineering measurements and the people who were more behind the lines, I think that's actually in some ways more interesting. People like the Tuskegee Airmen, and there was a tank battalion that was also solely African American. They are relatively well documented in comparison to this. So the more we can dig up on the behind the scenes, I think that's way more interesting, and it says a lot more about social impacts than being on the front line. So that will probably be where I go next, and whether I look into African American troops marrying white women in the UK and things like that. Who knows? It'll take me somewhere. But thank you.
Sort of a related question about folks who maybe got married.
Yeah.
We have a question: how many of these African American troops remained in the UK after the war, and do we even know that number?
Well, I definitely don't know a specific number. I actually would say that not many did, especially as they had already moved on to France, a lot of them. So I know that, for example, from research, that men who had relationships with white women often had a very difficult time either staying here or bringing over their white brides to the US, especially with the segregation in America. That was pretty much a no-go for them. So I doubt that many stayed at all. Definitely some probably did, but again, I don't know any specifics, sadly. That is just the nature of this topic and this research at the moment. Something that needs to be definitely, research needs to be put behind it. But yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, well, looks like we have one final question here online from James, saying that there are some great stories, which may be apocryphal, about local Norfolk people standing up on behalf of African Americans in restaurants or going into pubs when their presence was challenged by white US troops. He's wondering if this is something worth looking into, or maybe that's something you have come across already in your research.
Yeah, that is something that I have sort of come across. I know, I mean, not specifically in Norfolk, but I do know that in the UK as a general, there were definitely situations where white US troops came in and they said, this is our pub and we want it to no longer serve African Americans, and actually landlords saying, no, they were here before you and we prefer their money to yours, etc., which is quite an interesting situation. Definitely not one that I would say was common, probably. But I do know that in the local area, there were pubs that would accept it and would just say, right, well, we're going to be a white pub and another pub's going to be a black pub. And yeah, I don't think people challenged it as such. They were witness to it, but they definitely I don't think they challenged it. And the UK government didn't decide to challenge it. They said, well, we need to respect our allies and we'll let them do things how they want to do, which I think is a great shame. I think that there was a real opportunity there for Britain to put their foot down and say no. But I've come across some quotes from Winston Churchill himself about this topic, and he was pretty damning of the whole idea of integration himself. So yeah, I don't think that anybody challenged it necessarily, but it definitely put the African American troops in a unique situation where they, have experienced something just even slightly different to what they had back in the States. And I think that's definitely important. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, we have another question here in the room.
Yeah.
What you were just thinking about in terms of and the experience of African troops in the UK being better than in the States. Wondering about the civil rights movement and whether there were people who were maybe leaders of the civil rights movement who had still active service in the UK or abroad, where maybe they led to questioning about the way that they were treated in America?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and to be able to find a link between the guys who came over here and witnessed something else, and then to go back, and then, you know, in the following decade, suddenly this civil rights movement appears. I mean, African Americans have been downtrodden for centuries, so you can argue that, you know, the civil rights movement was already occurring at that point. It was a long civil rights movement, and that was the 1950s and 60s was just a small moment in it. However, the fact that there was such pressure in the 1950s and 60s after these servicemen came back, and I'd already touched on the fact that, you know, they came back and they weren't cared for as well, and that might have just been the last, you know, pin in the notice board of all the things that, you know, they were downtrodden on, and that might have helped spark that movement. Finding some key members of the civil rights movement who had experiences in the UK would be a fantastic way of sort of linking that. That would be brilliant, and hopefully I will be able to find some in the future, because I definitely want to go down that route and see if there is a link. I sort of very gently touched on it in my dissertation. However, I definitely want to sort of do a broader study on that. That would be fantastic. But yeah, thank you very much. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Any other questions?
This has been wonderful. Everyone's asked such great questions so far. So thank you. All right. Well, in that case, thank you all so much. Thank you again to Joel. This was fantastic. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you at our next American Library event. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Shut up.